Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
In the city of Arras in 1459, the word vaudois was a death sentence. The inquisitor who used it meant a crime, not a geography. Nocturnal flight to a mountaintop, a pact with the devil, the consumption of children, ritual orgies with demons. He called these gatherings vauderies. The participants were vaudois. 3 centuries earlier, the same word had described something else entirely. A vaudois was a follower of a cloth merchant in Lyon who had given away his fortune and started preaching voluntary poverty on city streets. 5 people died in Arras. Arras had never contained a single Waldensian. The distance from 12th century poverty movement to diabolical conspiracy is not a metaphor. It was a specific administrative transformation accomplished by specific people across specific decades. The Sabbat, the flying ointment, the pact with Satan, the infanticide and cannibalism, these elements were assembled into a legal and theological stereotype by inquisitors working Alpine trials between the 1420s and 1440s. The people they interrogated were Waldensians. The word they applied to those people eventually detached from any actual Waldensians and attached to anyone an inquisitor chose to call a witch. Around 1173, a wealthy cloth merchant in Lyon heard a street musician sing the life of Saint Alexis. The story was familiar. A Roman nobleman had left his family on his wedding night to live as an anonymous beggar, returned home unrecognized, lived under a staircase, and died there as a saint. The merchant consulted a theologian about the most direct road to salvation. The theologian gave him Matthew chapter 19, verse 21, "Sell what you have, give to the poor, come follow Christ." The merchant did it. Peter Waldo, known in French sources as Valdez de Leon, arranged for his wife to receive enough property for her maintenance, distributed the rest of his fortune to the poor, and hired 2 clerics to translate portions of the New Testament into Occitan so that he could preach in a language ordinary people understood. The Bishop of Lyon ordered him to stop. Waldo did not stop. In 1179, he sent delegates to Rome. The Pope approved their vows of voluntary poverty, but refused to authorize lay preaching without episcopal consent. Waldo kept preaching. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued the Decretal ad abolendum, which placed the poor of Lyon among the groups formally condemned as heretics, listed alongside Cathars and several other groups. The condemnation was not for doctrinal error. The poor of Lyon had not denied the Trinity, rejected the Incarnation, or proposed a dualist cosmology. What they had done was build a parallel religious infrastructure outside church control. They preached without ordination. They translated scripture into languages priests did not control. They heard confession and administered simplified sacraments outside the sacramental system. The institution found this more threatening than outright heresy because it was harder to argue against. The Waldensians were not wrong about anything in particular. They had simply stopped needing the church to be Christian. The Waldensian doctrine was organized around specific refusals, each of which attacked a different revenue stream or institutional mechanism of the church. They rejected purgatory as unscriptural. No text in the canonical New Testament described a middle state of purifying punishment between death and heaven. The Church's enormous system of masses for the dead, anniversary prayers, pilgrimages on behalf of deceased relatives, and the sale of indulgences to reduce a dead person's time in purgatory all depended on a doctrine the Waldensians could find no scriptural foundation for. A substantial portion of the late medieval Church's income derived from services rendered to the dead. The Waldensian rejection of purgatory was not primarily a doctrinal argument. It was an attack on a business model. They rejected oaths entirely. Matthew chapter 5 is unambiguous. Do not swear at all. The entire apparatus of medieval law and governance ran on oaths, swearing to tell the truth in court, swearing fealty to a lord, swearing on relics in legal proceedings. The Waldensians refused all of it. A witness who would not take an oath was unusable in court. Their position on oaths alone made them structurally incompatible with medieval civil society. They rejected the spiritual authority of a morally corrupt priest. A priest in mortal sin had no power to consecrate the Eucharist validly or grant effective absolution. This was the Donatist position, condemned by Augustine in the 5th century and consistently reappearing in every subsequent Christian reform movement. If the priest's personal virtue determined the validity of his sacraments, then the laity had a legitimate interest in monitoring their priest's behavior. And women preached in the early movement. Waldensian communities accepted women among their traveling preachers in the 12th and early 13th centuries. Women heard confession. Women administered the Eucharist. Inquisitors noted this repeatedly in their records with visible shock. By the end of the 13th century, one cluster of Waldensian communities proved far more durable than the rest. The valleys running southwest from Pinerolo in Piedmont, where the Alps begin their final descent toward the Po Plain, contained the most concentrated Waldensian population in Italy. The main communities were in the valley of Angrogna, in Torre Pellice, in Bobbio Pellice, and in the Lucerna Valley. The terrain was not idyllic. These valleys are narrow, the slopes steep, the winters long. But the severity that made them uncomfortable also made them defensible. Armies that could occupy a lowland city faced a different calculation in alpine terrain. Supply lines stretched over mountain passes. Communities in fortified villages above the tree line could hold positions against forces 3 and 4 times their size. The infrastructure the communities built for survival was the Barba network. The word barba means uncle in Occitan. It designated the traveling preachers who served as the mobile clergy of the Waldensian communities. 2 barba always traveled together, a senior preacher paired with a junior apprentice, moving through the network disguised as merchants or artisans. During the day, they lived in ordinary households. At night, in concealed interior rooms, they gathered the faithful, preached, heard confession, administered a simplified Eucharist, and distributed scriptural texts. The training for this role was extensive. Young men spent years in clandestine schooling, memorizing large quantities of scripture because they often could not safely carry written texts. The barba who emerged were, in practice, a separate trained clergy organized entirely outside the church's institutional structures. The communities that harbored them maintained collective silence under inquisitorial pressure. The network's survival for 2 centuries of active suppression required disciplined organizational culture at every level. When one member was arrested and interrogated, the community's survival depended on how much information the arrested person chose to provide. By the 1420s, the inquisitors most actively engaged in Alpine prosecution faced an uncomfortable fact. They had records going back to the 1280s. They had conducted multiple waves of trials, burned people, imprisoned others, confiscated property, forced public reconciliation ceremonies. The movement had absorbed all of it without collapsing. Ordinary heresy procedure was not adequate to the task. The medieval category of heresy covered doctrinal error. The legal procedures were well established. Inquisitors knew how to find heretics, interrogate them, and produce convictions. The problem was that the Waldensian communities kept existing after convictions and executions. The organizational structure replaced what it lost. Sorcery charges operated differently. Heresy was an offense against doctrine. Sorcery was an offense against the cosmic order, an active alliance with demonic power, causing tangible physical harm to neighbors through diabolical assistance. A witch killed your livestock, blighted your crops, caused impotence in your husband. A community that tolerated a witch was not sheltering wrong belief, it was allowing active harm to continue. The procedural implication was significant. Sorcery charges could reach people who had never themselves expressed wrong doctrine, but who had benefited from or failed to report someone with diabolical connections. The evidentiary standards were different. The community of protection around the Waldensian network was harder to prosecute for heresy than for complicity in sorcery. The fusion of the two charge categories was not sudden. Trial records from southern France and northern Italy across the late 14th century began to add sorcery elements to heresy interrogations. The questions that appear in records from the 1380s and 1390s are instructive. Did you attend meetings at night? Did you see people fly? Did you use ointments? Did you receive powders from a traveling man? These questions were being asked of Waldensians. The answers, given under conditions ranging from psychological pressure to active torture, accumulated. Each inquisitor who inherited a previous generation's trial records received names and testimony, and with them a template of expected answers. Each new confession that confirmed the template made the template more authoritative for the next interrogation. By the early 1420s, inquisitors in the Dauphiné, Savoy, and the Valais were working from a nearly complete stereotype. What it lacked was a systematic written account that assembled the elements into a unified legal description. 4 documents produced between roughly 1428 and 1440 provided exactly that. The earliest case is the set of prosecutions in the Diocese of Sion, in what is now the Swiss canton of Valais. In 1428, the bishop and secular judges initiated prosecutions against communities in the upper Rhone Valley. The accused were described as heretics attending nocturnal gatherings on mountain heights, worshiping the devil, killing children, and using the rendered fat of their victims in magical preparations. Over the following decade, more than 100 people were executed in the diocese. Claude Tolleson was a secular judge in the Dauphiné. Between 1426 and 1449, he conducted more than 200 prosecutions for what his records describe as the crime of the Wavah, working primarily in and around Briançon in the Hautes-Alpes. Around 1436, he wrote a Latin treatise setting down what he had encountered. Tholleson's detailed legal account of the Vaudois Sabbat as a coherent diabolical event with fixed organizational features. He describes a sect that gathers at night in remote locations presided over by the devil appearing in physical form. Members offer homage through a kiss on the devil's posterior. They trample the cross underfoot, consume a feast that includes the flesh of murdered children, have sexual relations without distinction of partner or kinship, and receive powders and ointments that enable them to kill livestock and children at will. Some apply ointments to sticks or benches that carry them through the air to the gathering. The overlap with recognizable Waldensian characteristics is structural and deliberate. The accused met secretly at night. They rejected the sacraments of the church. They preached without authorization. They had a traveling leadership that moved between household cells. Tholleson took the real organizational features of Waldensian practice and surrounded them with the diabolical supplement the law required. The Errores Gausseriarum was written around 1437, most likely in Savoy or the Dauphiné. The title means the errors of the Cathars. No author's name appears in any surviving manuscript. It reads as a formal manual of accusation, and the initiation ceremony it describes became the template for witch trial accounts throughout Europe. A novice presents himself at a sabbat brought by an existing member. He kisses a small toad on the mouth, then kisses the presiding master on the posterior. He renounces Christ and the Christian faith, specifically renouncing his baptism. He hands over a child, typically an infant, to be killed and rendered. He receives a packet of the resulting powder. The Sabbath feast is made from the flesh of murdered children. The devil presides. The gathering ends before dawn. The Aurores Assyriarum was written around 1437, most likely in Savoy or the Dauphiné. The title means the errors of the Cathars. No author's name appears in any surviving manuscript. It reads as a formal manual of accusation, and the initiation ceremony it describes became the template for witch trial accounts throughout Europe. A novice presents himself at a sabbat, brought by an existing member. He kisses a small toad on the mouth, then kisses the presiding master on the posterior. He renounces Christ and the Christian faith, specifically renouncing his baptism. He hands over a child, typically an infant, to be killed and rendered. He receives a packet of the resulting powder. The Sabbath feast is made from the flesh of murdered children. The devil presides. The gathering ends before dawn. The Aurores Gossariarum circulated quickly among inquisitors and theologians. Its description became the standard against which new confessions were measured. Future interrogators knew what answers to elicit. Accused people under sustained pressure knew or were shown what answers were expected. Johannes Nider, a Dominican friar, was completing a theological dialogue called the Formicarius at the Council of Basel between 1437 and 1438. Its fifth and final book turns to witchcraft, drawing on extended accounts from a secular judge who had conducted trials in the Swiss Bernese Oberland. The Formicarius introduced the Alpine witch trials to a European audience of theologians at one of the largest church councils of the century. The council fathers copied it, cited it, and carried it back to their home jurisdictions. When Heinrich Kramer published the Malleus Maleficarum in 1486, he drew on Nider's fifth book more heavily than on any other source. The Sabbat, as the Malleus described it, was the Sabbat as assembled in the Alpine inquisitorial operations of the 1420s and 1430s. The people those operations had targeted were Waldensians. In October 1459, an inquisitor named Jacques Dubois and the Bishop of Arras arrested a street musician in the city of Arras in northern France. The man's name was Robinet de Vaux. He was accused of attending a vauderie, a gathering of Vaudois, meaning a witch's sabbat in the full technical sense established by the 1430s literature. Under examination, Robinet confessed and named accomplices. Arras stood in the county of Artois. The nearest Waldensian valleys were over 700 kilometers away. No Waldensian community had ever existed in Artois or in any part of the Flemish or Burgundian territories. The word Vaudois had traveled north entirely as a technical term, stripped of its geographic origin and its doctrinal content, carrying only its inquisitorial meaning. A member of the diabolical sect who attends Sabbats, worships Satan, and kills children. The arrests expanded through 1460 and into 1461. Among those eventually accused were a painter, a woman named Margot de la Barre, and wealthy cloth merchants. The confessions were internally consistent because the interrogators knew what a vauderie looked like, and the accused, under sustained examination, provided what was expected. 5 people were burned. The Parliament of Paris reviewed the convictions in 1491, 30 years after the last executions, and annulled the judgments on the grounds that the confessions had been obtained under torture. The survivors and the families of the dead received official rehabilitation. But the rehabilitation came 30 years later, after 5 deaths and the permanent destruction of several lives and family fortunes. It also had no effect on the spread of the Vaudois terminology or the interrogation procedure to other jurisdictions. Both continued in active use for the next 2 centuries. A Vaudois in 1459 Arras had no connection to the Waldensians of Piedmont by any practical definition. He was simply someone an inquisitor had called one. Against the record of prosecutions, the Waldensians left a body of writing. The oldest surviving text associated with the movement is the Nobler Letzon, the Noble Lesson, a long verse sermon in Occitan that begins, O frères, escoutez, O brothers, listen. It is a meditation on Christian history from the creation to the present corruption of the Church, calling for repentance and criticizing clerical wealth. The Nobler Letzon does not describe flying ointments. There is no Sabbat in it, no orgiastic feast, no kiss offered to Satan. It is what inquisitors actually found in a Waldensian household, as distinct from what they claimed to find. The Barba network maintained a manuscript tradition that circulated through the community cells. The community's investment in written texts was practical, scripture and sermon material for a congregation that could not attend authorized churches, educational material for young men entering the Barba training system, and the shared literature that held a geographically dispersed movement together across generations. The Waldensian archive in Torre Police today holds over 40,000 documents spanning 7 centuries of community life, from inquisitorial trial records to personal correspondence with Oliver Cromwell's diplomatic representatives. The earliest manuscripts were collected and preserved after the Reformation because the Waldensians' existence as pre-Reformation Christians was useful to Protestant scholars who wanted to argue that authentic Christianity had always existed outside Rome. On April 24, 1655, Piedmontese troops and Catholic volunteer companies entered the Waldensian valleys of Piedmont under orders from Charles Emmanuel II, Duke of Savoy. The Easter massacres killed over 1,700 people by conservative estimates from contemporary witnesses. Villages were burned. Men, women, and children were killed in their homes, in their fields, and on the roads leading to higher ground. Survivors who fled into the upper elevations in inadequate clothing died of exposure. The reports crossed Europe through Protestant correspondence networks within weeks. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the English Commonwealth, declared a national day of fasting and humiliation for the Piedmontese victims. He organized a national collection that raised approximately £38,000. He sent letters to the Duke of Savoy through Cardinal Mazarin in Paris. He coordinated a joint Protestant response with Sweden, the Dutch Republic, and the Swiss Protestant cantons. His Latin secretary drafted the official correspondence. His Latin secretary was John Milton. Milton spent weeks in May and June 1655 drafting letters to European courts in formal humanist Latin. He also wrote one poem. Sonnet 18, known from its first line as Avenge, O Lord, was probably written in May 1655. It is 14 lines in the Italian sonnet form Milton preferred. It names the event without circumlocution. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold, even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones. The octave identifies the victims as the people who had preserved authentic Christianity through the centuries when England was still pagan. The sestet turns to Rome, calling it the Babylonian woe, and asks that God record the martyrs' blood and ashes in a book that would eventually produce 100-fold return. The sonnet is not contemplative. It is a political document in a lyric frame, addressed to an audience that already knew the facts. The massacres of 1655 did not end Waldensian life in the valleys. Cromwell's pressure and the European Protestant diplomatic response prevented a second campaign. But in 1685, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes set off a wave of anti-Protestant action across territories aligned with Louis XIV. The Duke of Savoy followed in January 1686, ordering the expulsion of all remaining Waldensians from their valleys. Several thousand people were marched to Piedmontese lowland detention camps through winter conditions. Hundreds died. The survivors arrived in Geneva and the Swiss cantons as stateless refugees. The expulsion was intended to be permanent. Henri Arnaud was a pastor from the valleys who had been in the Protestant Swiss territories since before the expulsion, serving the exile community from Geneva. He was also a former officer with military experience. By 1688, with the political situation in Europe shifting because of the formation of the Grand Alliance against Louis XIV, he began organizing a return by force. He gathered roughly 1,000 Waldensian men from the refugee population in Geneva and the Swiss cantons. On the night of August 16th and 17th, 1689, they boarded boats on Lake Geneva after dark, crossed the lake under cover of darkness, landed on the Savoyard shore near Nyon, and began marching southeast toward the Alps. The force Arnaud led had no realistic prospect of success by conventional military calculation. They were crossing enemy territory, lightly armed, without artillery or cavalry, heading into occupied mountains against Savoyard and French regular troops who had advance warning within days of the crossing. What they had was detailed knowledge of the terrain and a specific destination. They also had timing. William III of England had just taken the English throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and was assembling the coalition that would fight the 9 Years' War against Louis XIV. Savoy's participation in that coalition was under negotiation. Waldensian lives had diplomatic value. The march took 3 weeks through hostile alpine terrain in August heat. Savoyard and French units pursued and engaged the column at multiple points. They entered the valley of Angrogne in early September with fewer than 900 survivors. They held fortified positions in the upper valley through the winter of 1689 against multiple assault attempts, using terrain they knew intimately against troops who did not. William III pressed the Duke of Savoy as part of the ongoing negotiations over Savoyard entry into the Grand Alliance. Savoy needed Protestant allies and Protestant subsidies. In June 1690, the Duke issued a new edict restoring the Waldensians to their valleys. The returning communities found their homes burned and their fields untended for 4 years. They rebuilt. The date of the lake crossing, August 17th, remains the Waldensian Church's principal annual celebration, the Fête du 17 Août, observed in Torre-Pelisse and in Waldensian congregations internationally. The historians who have worked most carefully on the Alpine origins of the European witch hunt converge on a single structural observation. The diabolical Sabbat is not a list of magical practices. It is a mirror image of a church. A Sabbat has a gathering with a fixed location. It has a presiding figure with authority. It has a liturgy inverted from the Christian original, trampling the cross where you would kiss it, renouncing baptism where you would affirm it, offering homage to Satan where you would offer it to God. It has a feast with communal significance, the consumption of infant flesh, a diabolical parody of the Eucharist. It has a membership that knows itself as a membership, bound by shared oath and shared crime. The Sabbat is a congregation. It has everything a congregation requires. For this structure to be legally credible as a charge, the inquisitors needed a model for a real secret congregation. The Waldensian network was that model. The Barba network gathered at night. It met in private homes. It had traveling leadership that moved between cells. It rejected the sacraments of the official church and substituted its own forms. It had organizational continuity across generations and hundreds of miles. It maintained silence under pressure. The inquisitors did not invent the organizational features. They found them, documented them accurately, and then surrounded them with the diabolical supplement the law required: flight, infanticide, sexual inversion, explicit pact with Satan. These elements came from a combination of learned demonology, pre-existing folklore about night travelers and harmful magic, and the internal logic of what a secret anti-Christian society would have to do to be fully, legally, theologically real. Norman Cohn traced the history of the stereotype of the secret society of devil worshippers from Roman accusations against early Christians through medieval charges against heretics and Jews to the Alpine witch trials. The structure of the accusation was not new in the 1430s. What was new was the specific institutional model onto which it was mapped and the specific legal machinery that the 1430s documents provided for prosecuting it. The word vaudois is the clearest trace of the transfer. It began as a geographic and confessional designation, someone from the Waldensian tradition. It passed through a century of inquisitorial usage and emerged as a technical legal term meaning witch. The people in the Angronia Valley rebuilding their houses after 1690 had no connection to the Aras trials except through that word. The accusation that destroyed Aras merchants in 1459 had been constructed from an institutional portrait of communities like theirs. The communities in the Alpine valleys had survived the construction of the stereotype built from their organizational features. They had survived the massacres of 1655. They had survived the expulsion of 1686. They had marched back in 1689. By 1690, they were back in their valleys, rebuilding stone by stone, still using the same vernacular in the same churches, in the same geography where the whole apparatus had originated 5 centuries before. The Sabbat required their organizational reality to become imaginatively possible. Their theological position required their organizational reality to persist regardless. The two facts coexisted without resolution. They still do. If you found this episode useful, the full article is on the Crazy Alchemist website with sources, images, and the full text. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and we'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.